Hello guys, welcome back to Chris's Granite Paradise. Earlier this summer I did a video on the Yellowstone River. I was up there visiting in Montana and I walked along the river and we talked about 4 reasons why the Yellowstone, in my opinion, is such a hot spot for rockhounds. This is just a portion of the rocks that my family, and a good friend of mine who's given us a lot of material that we've rounded up over the last 30 years or so. And today I want to focus on one of the things I mentioned, which was the very complex geology that the river cuts through. And by geology, I mean not only the landscape as it is today, but especially paleo landscapes, rocks that have been reworked from other rivers and other mountain ranges that don't exist anymore. And all of this together has created an amazing variety that we can find. And that's why the title of today's video is So Much More Than Agates. So stick with us, enjoy the video. God bless you guys. Before we go outside and look at some rocks more specifically, about the different varieties and geologic history and background, I wanted to show you guys just real quickly this wall hanging I made back in 1997. Here's my hand for size reference. These are pretty big rocks I collected around Billings, and we'll talk about that a little later in the video. The rock varieties may vary quite a bit depending on where you are along the Yellowstone River. I worked in the granite shop, so I had some pretty good play privileges. I was actually partner at the time in the granite shop up there. And so I took these large rocks. They're actually, a lot of them are in the 6 or 7, maybe even 8-inch range. And we had a 14-inch blade. That's pretty standard for cutting granite countertops. So I mounted each rock in concrete. I made a mold. I think I used a milk carton or something along those lines, just so it would be square and it would sit on the saw table. I was able to cut halfway through, roughly, through the stone. I made 2 cuts with a 1/2-inch slab in between. Then I broke the rock out of the concrete, flipped it over, mounted it in the concrete again, and I had to get real good at lining up the cuts, making the cuts from the other side and having them hopefully line up with the first cuts. And I did pretty good enough to where I can grind them down and polish them. It's good to be artistic and create something with the rocks you collect. I've never been one to like piles. I always try to encourage people, do something with your rocks to use them in some interesting way. I'll take you out to the garage and I'll show you the cabinet that I made, because inadvertently I ended up with all these halves, the end cuts of all of these rocks. And I call this a cabinet, but it's probably more of a table or a storage box. And these are the halves I was telling you about. Most of these were left over from the wall hanging, but then I didn't have enough, so I had to intentionally cut, of course, other ones. There's always an excuse to play with more rocks. Here you can see a beautiful fossil ammonite. I believe that's what those are called. I'm probably not correct there. But that's in that sandstone conglomerate that we're going to look at later. Then this top is also made of rocks from the Yellowstone, and the way I cut these, again, I basically just made a big concrete block with all my favorite little rocks in it as the gravel. And these I cut on a tile saw, if I remember right. And the rocks popped right out of the cement being cut that thin, because I cut these down to like 1/8 of an inch maybe a little thicker. And then glued them to tiles, filled in the space between with epoxy and polished them down. Here are the other two sides in the sun, so that you can get a look at some more fascinating geology. Lots of beautiful porphyries. Here's a really nice migmatite. Of course, these come from the deepest levels where rock almost becomes molten again. Here's a beautiful porphyry with perfectly formed and quite large crystals. Those form in another environment. And this, I want to show this now because we're going to talk about this particular sandstone later. It's a sandstone that's exclusively made of little black pebbles. And here you can see the sedimentary layering very well. Remember this one later because we'll be bringing it up later in the video. Here's another conglomerate. I don't know if that is a brecciated quartzite. Again, there's just an infinite array of geology exposed in the rocks of the Yellowstone. I hope this gives you guys some inspiration of some of the many things you can do with your rocks. I think it would be unjust to talk about the immense variety of rocks that are in the Yellowstone River without first giving some credit to the rocks that are not in the Yellowstone River. You may be wondering what I mean by that. But when you consider that the Yellowstone River drainage area, according to my research, covers about 70,000 square miles, an area about the size of Oklahoma. And I know in the case of the Beartooth uplift, which when considering the rocks that are found in the Billings area, most of the drainage area that we can say is upstream from Billings is in that region. The Beartooths, the mountains that are immediately around there, maybe the Yellowstone Park area, and all the way down to where Billings is today. And that's maybe a third of that drainage area. And they say, if I remember my geology class correctly, that the Beartooth plateau or uplift area was pushed up approximately 3.5 miles. Feel free to correct me in the comments if I'm butchering anything. But that's a lot of rock. And we have to assume that a similar amount of rock has been eroded by wind and water, etc., over the rest of the drainage area. It's just that since there wasn't uplift, there wasn't the elevation involved. Nonetheless, it has been eroding. Here's a nice Montana agate for you guys who love the agates. And here's another one. So where is all that material? It's a tremendous amount of material if you think about it. Well, every year when you watch the river, especially at flood stage, the amount of sand and mud being washed away is also an astronomical amount, and it really adds up to the volume we're talking about if you multiply that out over geologic time. So why do we have the rocks that we do then? Be it agates, be it whatever. Why do we have these rocks? Well, geologists refer to two major forms of weathering. One is mechanical weathering, which is where a rock is physically assaulted by rubbing against other rocks, by frost, by shattering, maybe tree roots if it happens to be buried in a riverbank and tree roots are growing through it. Anything physical would be considered mechanical weathering. But another major assailant of our rocks is chemical weathering. Obviously, most of that has to do with water. For example, shales, gypsums, of course salt, if the river cuts through any salt layers, or coal. These are things that are easily attacked by water. Gypsum, for example, is a salt and it eventually dissolves. So these are two factors that really reduce the rock volume, if I could use that term. And frost is really a lot bigger of an enemy than we think of. For example, I'm going to show you guys a rock similar to material that we find in the Yellowstone. Here's a rock, I actually bought it on eBay from Oregon, a lower elevation in Oregon, and this looks like very similar to material we find in the Yellowstone. But this variety of flower stone, it's actually a basalt with phenocrysts in it, and this variety is just porous enough that within one season sitting out here, I'm in Colorado, so we have frost here, and in one season these rocks, they became nothing. They're like sponges. So this is a rock that you probably, I mean, we know it probably, there were rocks similar to this extruded around the Yellowstone volcano, among other places. But we would never see them because they would never survive long enough to make it down the river. And we can say the same thing about shales. We can say the same thing about many sandstones, conglomerates, a lot of fossils. So much rock volume we'll never see because of frost and because of erosion. And so the only rocks we have is probably an extremely small percentage of materials that have survived and made their way down to us. And that's what we're looking at on my sculptures here. In case you're wondering, all these rocks we're looking at, these two sculptures here are both dedicated to all Yellowstone materials. An incredible variety. So I want to talk about agates and septarian nodules, because they're on about opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of resistance to both mechanical and chemical weathering. So this is a septarian nodule. Any of you from Billings, if you've gone to the South Hills are full of these. Only in the hills, most of them are about the size of cars. But if you break into them, often they're full of beautiful crystals. But they are basically kind of like a limestone. They occur in a shale, the Bear Paw Shale, which underlies Billings, and it also underlies the rims. It's just a very soft shale, basically dirt. There really is, I mean, it has some layers of thinner sandstone going through it, but most of it is just mud. But in that mud, these concretions grew and developed. And so since these are harder, they're eroding out of that shale, and of course they fall into the river. But to be honest with you, they don't go far because they're very susceptible to frost. Like that one I was just showing you, if you don't find it the same year that the river plucks it out of the bedrock, it'll probably disintegrate. Here's a bigger one that I cut into bookends years ago. You can see the beautiful veining. Really nice material. But these you're only going to find like adjacent to where they're falling out of the bedrock. Adjacent to where they're falling into the river. They probably won't roll. I'd be surprised if they even roll a mile, to be honest with you. Maybe some of you who have a little more experience on the river, you can correct me there. But then on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have again the Montana agates. Agates, of course, are a form of quartz. Here's another one. This is one of my favorites. My wife found this about 25 years ago or so. It weighed 9 pounds originally. Then I cut a section off of it and tried to polish it. Here's another beautiful agate. So the agates, being quartz, they're completely unsusceptible to any kind of water, chemical weathering doesn't affect agates, I think, at all. Probably the only thing we can say that might happen to an agate after it's been sitting out in the sun for a while, you know how they kind of turn white, they get that patina on them. But it doesn't affect their shape at all. They really don't erode. And so my theory, and again I could be wrong, is that the reason as you go further east along the Yellowstone, there seems to be more agates. And I don't think it's so much that there are more agates as much as it is that more of the other rocks are gone. They've been ground down to nothing, they've been eroded, and so you end up with a higher percentage of jaspers and agates. Ah, my pudding stones. Here's another agate. See the light go through it like that. Maybe you guys know about sand. Scientists say that sand is considered a mature sand when it becomes all quartz. For example, if you go to some of the beaches in Florida or California or wherever, and the sand is pure quartz. Well, we know it didn't start that way. Mountain ranges eroded away, ground up into sand-sized particles, and eventually, after a long time, quartz is all that's left. And I think that's what's going on as you get out to eastern Montana. There just aren't very many other rocks that made it that far. And so you have what appears to us as a higher percentage of jaspers and agates. Here's jasper and agate together. Because those rocks are just so much harder. No chemical weathering affects them, and they're very resistant to physical or mechanical weathering. So I hope that explanation makes sense. We need to give honor to the rocks that we will never see. Moving along now to the rocks that we do have. As you're standing on the bank of the Yellowstone, maybe in Billings or somewhere else, and looking at this beautiful gravel bar. I've said before that every rock is a snapshot. It's like God's photo album of everything that has ever gone on in the past was just dumped out at random. Every rock captures some moment in the deep past, and I've always loved the deep past. I love imagining previous landscapes, again, I'm an evangelical Christian, so I believe in God, of course, and that He is eternal, has no beginning and no end. And so He's been creating and recreating this humble planet of ours, this little blue dot, for a very long time. Scientists say about 4.5 billion years. Whether that's true or not, none of us were there, so it's hard to know. But 4.5 billion years compared to no beginning and no end isn't even a scratch. So with that said, I've taken some rocks off my sculptures and kind of grouped them into what I consider interesting groupings, and you can do this differently, of course. And we're going to say, for the sake of simplicity, that there are two sources for all of these rocks. They're hard, they resisted the chemical and mechanical weathering, and here they are. But they come from two basic sources. One is from, for example, a known location or mountain range. For example, did they roll down to us from the Beartooths, where they plucked, as we talked earlier about the septarian nodules, where they plucked out of the riverbed near where we're standing. And then the other source of the two sources is what I call, and what geologists refer to as reworking. And that is where, a landscape or a mountain range erodes. There are massive deposits of gravel that eventually become a conglomerate. A conglomerate, to give you an idea, where did I put it? These are conglomerates. So basically a rock made of other rocks. We could say cement is a conglomerate. It's a man-made conglomerate, to give you an idea. So these conglomerates then later, after eons and landscapes have changed, maybe the source of the rocks in that conglomerate is long gone, but these conglomerates are still actually forming part of the landscape today. There are cliffs and exposures of conglomerate that's pretty hard, and so they resist, and they become the high points. They were at one point the riverbed or a beach, and then now they become the mountain range just because of how hard they are. So conglomerates are fascinating that way, but anyway, so as these conglomerates are eroded and these rocks break out again, that's called reworking. And I don't have any good photographs or images, videos, I'm sorry, of conglomerates along the Yellowstone. I've seen them, and I know they're abundant, as here's an example of some conglomerates of small pebbles right here. But I'm going to insert here some photos of a beach in San Diego. It's called Tourmaline Beach. And that's a classic example of reworking. The cliff is made of an ancient conglomerate, pretty large rocks actually in that cliff, and the waves are breaking it apart, and now the beach is covered with those rocks. So those rocks are being reworked. They're being eroded again, moved around, and in fact, I have a huge display of rocks from Tourmaline Beach up on the bell tower here. And so those rocks, I picked them up off the beach, but they're not originally from that beach. They're from a paleo landscape. They're from some mountain range, some landscape that doesn't exist anymore. And now they're again rolling around on the beach. So that's reworking. So in the Yellowstone, we have rocks from current sources and rocks that are being reworked. So let's quickly go through just some simple groupings I did. These are volcanic rocks. We can safely assume that most of these are probably eroding out of the Beartooths and out of the Yellowstone Park area, because we can find today plenty of similar rock up there. They might have come from, several thousand feet or even a mile above the current landscape, but they're from that area. Just have some what I call volcanic breccias. Here's one that I cut and polished. I almost like to call these ignimbrites, but in the technical sense, ignimbrites are from pyroclastic flows, and they tend to be more pumicey, and these are very solid, so I'm assuming they're from some kind of lava flow. Here's another one that's magnetic. You can see my little magnet on here. A lot of iron in that one. Beautiful river-rounded basalt. I love the basalts. They're actually, sometimes we think of basalt as a boring rock, but they can really show us a lot in terms of the geologic past. Here's a nice one that it looks like this maybe was where lava was cascading over a little lava fall. We can't say a waterfall, but you could see it's solidified in such a way. Maybe you've seen soap, hand soap in a bottle, and it has that silky look to it. Depending on how you pour it in the bottle, the particles align, and this is similar to that. Next, we have the conglomerates. These show us a lot about some paleo landscapes in what is now the Yellowstone drainage area. This one appears to be composed exclusively of basalt. It's heavy to the feel. It's quite solid, and all the rocks are black. And these, I can honestly say, I've known of the source. Back in 1996 in the granite shop, a gentleman came in with a truckload of moss rock. It was this material, same size pebbles. They were all black, but in a natural broken rough sandstone form on pallets, selling it as moss rock. It had the lichen all over it. And he said his ranch was up by Columbus, Montana. So those of you who know, you might have seen the source where this is coming from. And these conglomerates, I think, were also collected in Billings. I did not find this. My friend gave it to me. Same with this one. Then next to it, I grouped some fossils. And fossils can be really anything. Of course, we have the petrified wood. I'm not going to talk too much about petrified wood or agates because there are plenty of channels dedicated to those two rocks. It seems that's what everybody collects. But also, here's some petrified algae, some coral. Very nice material. These corals were collected in further east, I believe around Glendive. So further east on the Yellowstone. Then we have the sandstones. And we would think that the Yellowstone would be predominantly sandstone because it cuts through so much sandstone. All of eastern Montana, everywhere from, the mountains from its source east is pretty much all sandstones and shales. But there really are relatively few. And again, it goes back to those that can withstand mechanical and chemical weathering. And I have not discovered the sources of these, so they may be being reworked. You guys who collect more often may have seen the source. I'd love to see the source of these with the hematite banding going through them. Very attractive stone. And these, I believe, are exclusively being reworked because I've seen these in the conglomerates high above the river. In gravel pits and so forth that are digging into ancient gravels. I've seen these aventurines. Let's spray them. Brings out the color a little more. Beautiful quartz. It's quartz with a type of mica that gives it the green color. But they're common enough in the Yellowstone that if you look for them, you can find several of them. They're not quite as common as some other rocks, but they're very attractive. And I would venture that the source for these does not exist. If you know of the source, it would be cool to know. Then we have, of course, the pudding stones, or leopard rocks as some of us call them. And these actually should be, in fact, I'll move one over here to symbolically represent. They should be part of the porphyry group. Here are several porphyries. These porphyries are very hard. If you look at aerial views of certain areas in the Beartooth Mountains, there were some super volcanoes or some large volcanoes that are now eroded. And for miles in every direction from the volcanoes, there are these dikes and sills, which are cracks in the rock that filled with magma that was partially cooled. And there are about as many varieties of porphyries as there are of the dikes and sills, as the number of dikes and sills. Everyone's a little different. I just put a few here to give an idea. I don't want to skip over the agates and jaspers. Agates and jaspers, at least the Montana agates, I've heard it said that they, for sure, their source no longer exists. They're just hard enough that they keep being deposited and re-eroded and redeposited, and they stick with us. They might have come from high above our heads. Imagine yourself standing on the riverbank picking up an agate. You got to remember that as these rocks are rolling downstream, they're also cutting down. As the river digs through the rock, the agates are coming down with it. So these are interesting that way. They really communicate some history. And of course, the jaspers can really be any color you can imagine. This is one of my favorites here. Very unique pattern. Okay, and then I have what I call the onesie twosies. I'm a granite guy. Granite countertop business was my career. So I like the different granites and different stones. Sometimes I cut them and polish them. Here's a beautiful, just a red, coarse granite. Some of these we might be able to find the sources, some of them probably not. This is more like a unikite. It's got the greens, several shades of the greens, and also that nice pink. Anyway, so we could add to this any number of rocks, but this gives us an idea. This is why I say in the Yellowstone there is so much more than just agates. It's an amazing river with an amazingly complex geology. Thank you for sticking with me. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you found it enlightening and that it inspires you to get out and pick up rocks. God bless you guys as always. We'll see you on the next one. Always good to spend time with you.